The deputy fought his way through chest-high brush for nearly a quarter-mile before the cabin finally came into view. His boots were soaked through from the creek bed, and the signal on his radio kept cutting out as the mountains swallowed the frequency. Nobody had bothered to climb up this specific crease in the hills for a long time, and the land made sure you felt every step of that neglect. When he finally broke through the tree line, he stopped dead in his tracks. Two figures were sitting on the porch in the fading light. One of them slowly turned to look at him, but the other one didn't move an inch. There was something about that stillness that told the deputy everything he needed to know before his brain could even process the scene. He eventually radioed back to the county office to report what he'd found. The paperwork he filed later that afternoon used a word that nobody in the department expected to see. He didn't call the scene disturbing or dangerous. Instead, the word he wrote down was comfortable. He described two figures on the porch, one of them deceased, and noted that the entire situation appeared perfectly comfortable. This leads us to the question that is going to follow us through this entire story. How does a man spend 30 years alone in the mountains without actually being alone at all? More importantly, we have to ask what it truly costs a person to answer that question the way Elias Cutter did. There is a kind of silence that only those who have been to the mountains of eastern Kentucky truly know. It isn't the tranquil silence you might find on a Sunday afternoon in town. It is another kind entirely, something dense and alive that fills your ears the same way cold water fills your boots. Cutter's Hollow sits deep in a crease of the Cumberland Plateau, where two massive ridge lines lean toward each other without ever quite touching. The gap between those peaks is maybe 300 yards at its widest point. By 2 in the afternoon, the sun has already dipped behind the rim, which means the hollow drops into deep shadow, while the rest of the county is still bathed in full light. It is the sort of place that winter always finds first and leaves last. The valley wasn't always this empty. During the early part of the 20th century, 4 or 5 families worked that rocky land. They shared a hand-dug well about halfway up the hollow and kept a tacit agreement to stay out of each other's business. They built their lives in that specific Appalachian way, not exactly together, but in parallel lines that were close enough to help when the need was real, and far enough apart to pretend it never was. The hollow began to empty out after the Second World War ended. The young men who left for the service either came back changed or didn't come back at all. And the coal camps 20 miles to the east were pulling people out of the hills with the promise of steady wages. By the early 1950s, only 2 families remained, and by the 1970s, there was only 1 man left. Elias Cutter was 3rd-generation Hollow through and through. His grandfather had cleared the original plot of land, his father had built the cabin that still stood there, and Elias had simply stayed behind. He wasn't staying because he was afraid of the outside world or trying to make a statement, but because the idea of leaving never crossed his mind in any serious way. To him, the hollow was the entire world, and everything outside those ridges was just somewhere else. He wasn't an unusual man for his time and place, at least not at first. Plenty of men his age in eastern Kentucky lived alone on land their families had worked for generations. What set Elias apart wasn't where he lived, but rather what happened to him there, and the choices he made afterward. The silence pressing against the walls of that cabin wasn't just a result of geography. It was an accumulation of years, and it was about to get a great deal heavier. His wife was named Ruth, and she fell ill during a January that seemed to freeze the very air in the hollow. It started as a simple cough, but within a week, the sickness had drained every bit of color from her face and left her hollowed out. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away in Harlan, which meant traveling over roads that weren't really roads at all once the winter mud and ice took hold. By the 3rd day of her fever, she couldn't even sit up in bed, and by the time the sun went down on that 3rd night, she was gone. Elias reacted the only way a mountain man knows how, which was to put his hands to work. He stepped out into the pre-dawn cold and split enough wood to last 3 days, stacking it neatly under the eave, before he finally forced himself back inside. He stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time, looking at what was left of his life, before he finally wrapped Ruth in the quilt her mother had stitched together. He carried her to the chair by the front window, sat her down, and then went right back outside to split more wood. He didn't bury her. It is easy to look at a choice like that and try to find a label for it, like shock, or the fact that the Kentucky ground was frozen too hard for a shovel. Maybe his mind just snapped under the weight of the silence. But the people who study these kinds of cases say the reason doesn't actually matter. What matters is what happened next. Because that first week turned into a month, and the dry cold of the cabin began to change things in a way he either understood or chose to ignore. She was still there. He was still talking to her, and by the time the spring thaw finally arrived, the habit had become a permanent part of his world. 2 years later, his son Thomas died in a logging accident on the ridge just above their home. A tree came down the wrong way, and Elias was the one who found him before dark and carried him down the slope in his own arms. He brought the boy inside, cleaned the dirt from his skin, and dressed him in his best shirt before sitting him down at the kitchen table. It was the exact same ritual he had performed for Ruth, and just like that, the table was no longer empty. Now there were 2 of them. You have to understand that grief in a place as isolated as that hollow doesn't look like the grief you see in town. In a regular community, loss has a specific architecture made of funeral homes, preachers, and neighbors who bring over casseroles to fill the silence. There is usually a date carved into a headstone that tells the world the mourning period is officially over, even if the person inside is still hurting. Those rituals are designed to tell you when it is time to stop grieving, or at least when you are supposed to start pretending that you have moved on. Elias lived outside of all those rules, because no preacher ever made the trip up that hollow road, and no neighbors were left to check on him. The loss just sat there in the cabin, like a heavy mist, and since there was no structure to tell him how to let go, he built a world where he didn't have to. He kept them close. He kept the fire burning, and he set the table every single day, while he told them exactly what he planned to do with his afternoon. Some people would call that madness, but that word is usually thrown around by folks who have never lost everything, in a place where no one was watching. What Elias created wasn't a delusion, because he knew perfectly well that Ruth and Thomas were dead. He had watched his wife's breath stop, and he had carried his son's body home, so he wasn't confused about the reality of the situation. He simply refused to let the loss be total, and keeping them there was his way of negotiating with death, so he could lose them slowly instead of all at once. The folks in the mountains have a specific name for people who live like that, and while it isn't exactly kind, it isn't meant to be cruel either. They call them keepers, referring to the men and women who hold on to the past long after the rest of the world has let it go. Elias stayed a keeper for nearly 30 years, living in that quiet cabin before anyone ever thought to climb the hill and ask him why. The cabin was a simple place with only 3 rooms to its name. There was a main room with a stone hearth, a back bedroom where Elias slept, and a small, narrow space off the kitchen that had belonged to Thomas. After the accident on the ridge, Elias moved a second chair to the main table so his son could join them. Ruth kept her place by the window, while Thomas sat at the table, and Elias organized his entire life around them, like a man arranging his furniture to catch the heat of a fire. Every morning started the same way, with Elias making enough coffee for 3 people. He would pour 2 cups that he never intended to touch, set them down in their places, and then drink his own while standing by the stove. He talked to them the whole time, but it wasn't the aimless muttering of a lonely man. He spoke to them directly, by name, giving them small reports on whether the creek was running high, or what the weather looked like as it rolled off the ridge. When evening came, he said his prayers out loud, in the same short, specific way his mother had taught him years before. He didn't ask for much, and he always delivered the words while facing the table where his family sat. It was a rhythm that never wavered, a constant heartbeat in a house that should have been silent. As the seasons turned, he made sure to explain the changing work on the farm to the two of them. When planting time arrived, he would sit down and lay out exactly what he was putting in the ground and where the rows would go. By the time fall rolled around, he would give them an account of the harvest, mentioning which fences needed mending or which part of the roof had started to leak. He talked to them the way any man coming home from a long day of work talks to the people he loves. The most striking thing about this is that he wasn't confused, which is something the social worker noted repeatedly when she finally made it up the hollow road. Elias never tried to claim that Ruth and Thomas were still alive, and he would actually correct you if you suggested they were. When she asked him about it directly, he stated plainly that Ruth had been gone since a January he didn't care to count back to, and he said it without flinching. He treated their deaths as permanent facts of his life. Then he simply turned around and offered the woman another cup of coffee. The actual physical reality of that cabin is a lot harder for most people to wrap their heads around. The air on the Cumberland Plateau is incredibly dry, and a wood stove running all winter long acts like a dehumidifier that sucks the moisture out of everything. Because the winters were so brutal, the inside of the cabin stayed near freezing for months at a time, which created a natural preservation process. He hadn't used any chemicals or special tools, but by the time anyone else saw them, the figures at the table looked like something caught between an old photograph and a hard truth. A man named Cecil Combs was the first person to stumble onto the secret while he was running a trap line along the ridge in the early 1980s. He followed a creek that cut across the back of the property and happened to glance through the cabin window where he saw the figures sitting at the table. He stood there frozen for what felt like a full minute before he turned around and walked back into the woods without saying a word. He didn't tell his wife or his sons, and he kept that secret for 15 years before he finally let it slip to the wrong person. The whole situation almost ended naturally during the winter of 1989. Elias caught a chest sickness in November that left him unable to get out of bed for nearly 6 weeks, leaving him too weak to hunt or even walk down to the main road. He survived by eating dried corn and beans he had stored away, melting snow for water by keeping a bucket near the stove. By the time January arrived, he had lost so much weight that he had to punch 2 new holes in his belt with a nail. But he managed to pull through. He was entirely alone during those dark months, at least in the way the rest of the world counts such things. But for Elias, the house was never empty, and that was the only thing that kept him going. There is a particular quality to official absence in the rural parts of Appalachia, and it doesn't look like neglect from the inside. To the people living there, it looks like respect. You do not go up a man's hollow without an invitation. You do not ask questions that aren't your business. And you certainly don't report what you saw through a window, if reporting it means explaining why you were looking in the first place. Elias Cutter stopped filing paperwork with the county sometime in the late 1960s, which meant no tax returns, no property filings, and no response to census mailings. His name existed in the older records the way a watermark exists in old paper, where it was visible if you held it up to the right light, but invisible otherwise. Nobody went looking for him specifically because nobody had a reason to, and since he wasn't wanted for a crime and wasn't owed any money, he was just a man in a hollow that nobody drove past on the way to anywhere else. The county had dozens of places just like Cutter's Hollow, which were really just creases in the plateau that the road system had bypassed when it was built, and never circled back to fix. People lived in those places, or had lived in them once, and the county's relationship with that fact was one of practiced inattention. The welfare office had a term for it called benign neglect, and that is a phrase that sounds almost kind until you actually think about what it's describing. There were three specific moments that can be pieced together when the outside world came close enough to find him. The first happened in the mid-1970s, when a county welfare worker drove out to check on residents in the area after a particularly hard winter. She made it as far as the creek crossing below the hollow, but she found the footbridge washed out and decided to turn around. She noted in her file that access was not possible and marked the visit as an attempt, but nobody ever rebuilt the bridge and nobody ever went back. The second moment came around 1983, when a timber company ran a survey of harvestable land in that section of the plateau. Their crew mapped the ridgelines above the hollow and noted the presence of a structure below, but they flagged the parcel as privately held and not worth pursuing for their business. The survey report still exists today, but the name Elias Cutter is nowhere in it. The third was a phone call in 1991 from someone in the county seat who had heard, secondhand, that an old man was living alone up past the Combs Ridge. The call went to the sheriff's department, and a deputy was dispatched to the area, but he found the hollow road overgrown past the first bend and called it in as a dead end. He never got close enough to see the cabin, and he never saw the man living inside it. Each of those near misses had its own logical reason for stopping short, whether it was the washed-out bridge, the overgrown road, or the indifference of a timber crew focused on bored feet instead of people. But when you take them together, they describe something much larger than bad luck or poor planning. They describe a system that was only ever going to find Elias if someone who already knew about him finally decided to speak up. And that is the part worth sitting with for a moment, because somewhere in America right now, there are people who have fallen just as far out of the frame. These aren't criminals, and they aren't exactly hiding. They are just people the official machinery passed over once, and then again, and then enough times that the passing over became permanent. Elias wasn't the exception to the rule. He was just the one someone finally talked about. That someone was the granddaughter of Cecil Combs, and she decided to talk to a teacher. Cecil Combs died in the winter of 1996 at 71 years old, and he spent his last few weeks in a hospital bed in Harlan. Somewhere in those final weeks, he told his granddaughter Marcy what he had seen through that cabin window 15 years earlier. He didn't tell her as a confession, but he told her the way old men tell things they've held too long, which is quietly, and without a lot of explanation, like setting down a heavy bag they'd finally gotten used to carrying. Marcy was 17 at the time, and she sat with that information for about a week before she told her history teacher, a woman named Sandra Phelps. Sandra had moved to Harlan from Cincinnati 6 years prior, so she still hadn't fully adjusted to the local understanding of which things you reported and which things you were supposed to absorb and forget. Sandra called the county social services office that same afternoon. The social worker assigned to the case was named Deb Akers, and she had been doing rural home visits for 11 years, which gave her a reliable sense of what she was walking into before she ever arrived. She expected to find an elderly man in poor health, who was suffering from some neglect and maybe a bit of confusion, because that was the usual picture when a call came in about someone that isolated and that old. She drove up what was left of the hollow road on a Tuesday morning in April, parked her car where the track gave out, and walked the rest of the way on foot. When she finally came out of the tree line, Elias was already standing on the porch. He watched her come across the yard and said good morning before she even reached the steps. She introduced herself, and he simply nodded, held the door open, and invited her in for coffee. The figure sitting at the table in the window were the first thing she saw when she stepped inside. She wrote in her notes later that she stood very still for a moment, and then Elias said, "That's Ruth, and that's Thomas," as he gestured at each of them in turn, the way you would introduce any other family members. He knew the year, and he knew who was president, and when she asked him what corn was trading for, he gave her a number that was within the right range. His responses were direct, his thinking was clear, and he showed no distress at her presence or the questions she was asking him. He answered everything she wanted to know, poured her a cup of coffee, and sat across the table from his son's preserved remains to see what she needed next. The darkness in that room wasn't born from confusion, and that is what stuck with her the most when she thought about it later. It wasn't the darkness of a man who had lost his grip on reality, but it was something else entirely. The darkness of a man who had made a decision she didn't have a category for. He had lived inside that decision for so long that it had become the most normal thing in the world to him.
Cecil Combs had kept quiet for 15 years, and you could call that cowardice if you want, or you could call it the frontier understanding that a man's grief is his own land. You don't cross another man's land without an invitation, and whether his silence protected Elias or cost him something is not a question with a clean answer. But now the county knew the truth, and the county was going to do exactly what counties do. 3 men drove up that winding hollow road the following week, and the group included a county judge named Harold Fitch, an adult protective services supervisor, and a psychiatrist named Dr. Warren Gill. Dr. Gill had traveled all the way up from Lexington for the occasion, and he was wearing a pair of dress shoes that were completely wrong for the rough mountain terrain. They parked their vehicle exactly where Deb Akers had left hers, and walked in a single-file line through that same thick tree line toward the house.
Elias met them at the door and made coffee for everyone. The psychiatric evaluation took up most of the morning, as Dr. Gill ran through the standard battery of orientation questions, memory sequences, and capacity assessments. Elias answered every single question without hesitation, showing that his recall was perfectly intact, and his reasoning was entirely linear. He scored in the normal range across every measure the doctor used, which created a problem that nobody had fully anticipated. The legal machinery that had driven these 3 men up a washed-out hollow road was built for a different situation than the one they actually found. When Gill asked Elias directly whether he believed Ruth and Thomas were still alive, Elias looked at him the way you would look at someone who had just asked if the sky was attached to the ground. He simply said, "No." He explained that Ruth had been gone since a January he counted back to with some reluctance, and Thomas had passed 2 years after that, and he said it in a tone that made it clear he did not need a psychiatrist to tell him what he already knew. Gill noted in his final report that the subject showed no signs of delusional ideation, no psychosis, and no cognitive impairment. The man knew they were dead, but the reality was that he just had not finished grieving them yet. 30 years into that process, with no sign that he was anywhere close to the end, the state had driven up to his front porch to ask him what he planned to do about it. The legal question circulated through the local offices for several weeks, without a clean answer ever attaching to it. No specific statute covered what Elias had done in a way that made a prosecution straightforward or even logical. There were some old public health codes regarding the disposal of human remains, but those rules had never been applied to a case with this particular shape. The county attorney eventually decided the path of least resistance was to frame the whole thing as a welfare matter rather than a criminal one, which meant the final outcome would be care instead of charges. That decision probably felt like an act of mercy to the people who made it in their offices. To Elias, it did not feel like anything he had a word for in his own vocabulary. They moved him to a residential care facility just outside of Harlan in the late fall of that year, placing him in a clean room with 3 meals a day and a staff that spoke to him gently. Within 2 weeks of arriving, he had stopped eating full meals, and within a month he was sleeping only a few hours a night. He asked the staff regularly when he could go back home, not in an agitated or angry way, but in the flat and persistent way of a man who was simply waiting for the correct answer to a question he already knew. He asked them every day, and he never missed a single day. The remains of Ruth and Thomas were removed from the cabin by a county health crew shortly after Elias was relocated to the facility. They were examined, documented, and eventually buried in a county cemetery on the outskirts of Harlan. The burial was a purely administrative task, with no service and plain plot markers to show where they lay. Elias was never told the exact date the burial happened, and he never asked about it, possibly because asking would have meant acknowledging a second loss he was not ready to name. The system found a resolution that was tidy and efficient, and the paperwork was closed out cleanly once the problem had been identified and addressed. Elias died 14 months after he left the cabin, and the official cause of death was listed as natural cardiac failure, consistent with his age. But the nurse who had been in charge of his care during those final weeks said something in a private conversation that never made it into any official record. She said he reminded her of a plant that had been moved too late in the season, and while he was not exactly sick, he had just stopped. He stopped eating with any real conviction, and he stopped tracking the window to see what the weather was doing outside. He even stopped asking about going home, which was the part that worried the nurse the most, because as long as he was asking, there was still something pulling him forward. When he finally stopped asking, she said it was like watching a door close from the inside of a house. Researchers who study extreme isolation often use a phrase that keeps coming up in the literature, which is grief without witness. The core idea is that loss does not process the same way when there is no one else there to receive it or acknowledge it. Grief is partly a social act, where you tell someone what happened and they acknowledge the pain you feel. That acknowledgement does not fix the situation, but it confirms that the loss was real and that the world registered the subtraction of a life. Without that witness, the mind does not always know how to move forward, and sometimes it does not move at all. Elias had no witness for Ruth and no witness for Thomas. He was entirely alone when each of them died, alone in the days that followed, and alone in the decades that came after. The loss happened entirely inside the walls of that cabin, with no one to confirm it, which meant there was no one to sit across from him and say that this was real and terrible, and that he could finally stop holding on to it. Because there was no one else to hold it, he kept holding it himself. The Appalachian context is very important here, and I don't mean that in the romanticized way people sometimes talk about mountain culture. Stoicism in these communities was not a virtue people chose the way you would choose a philosophy to follow. It was a survival trait, bred into the bones of people who had been living with scarcity and distance and hard loss for many generations. You did not fall apart, because falling apart was expensive, and nobody in the hollows could afford the downtime that came with it. You worked through grief the way you worked through a bad winter, meaning you kept your head down and your hands moving until you got to the other side. That strategy works when the losses are the kind a community can absorb together, but it fails when the losses take everything and there is no community left to help. When that stoicism meets total isolation and catastrophic grief at the same time, the mind does not necessarily break down. It improvises and builds whatever structure is available to survive the day. For Elias, the only available structure was the cabin and the chairs and the daily routine of a family that still needed tending even after they were gone. The preserved remains were not the actual disease in this story, but rather they were the symptom of a man operating with none of the tools grief is supposed to use. He had no ritual and no witness and no permission to stop what he was doing. Every other documented case of prolonged grief behavior in isolated communities follows this same basic shape, and there are more of these cases than most people realize. The behavior looks extreme from the outside, but from the inside, it is just the only available answer to an unanswerable question. This brings you to the hardest thing about what the state did when they finally found Elias in that cabin. It was not the legal process or the removal of the remains that mattered most, but the question of what healing would have actually looked like for him. What did the county offer him that was truly better than what he already had in the woods? They gave him a clean room and a staff that meant well, along with 3 meals and a window that faced a parking lot. They gave him safety, but they took away every single thing that had kept him alive for 30 years. Whether those two things can both be true at the same time is the question his story leaves sitting in the room with us. The cabin is still standing back there, or at least it was the last time anyone had a reason to make the long walk in. These days, nobody has a reason to check anymore. The county welfare office closed their file years ago, and the health department did the same, leaving the woods to reclaim what's left. The only people who ever set foot on that hollow road now are hunters who don't know the history, or the rare person who knows exactly what happened, and goes anyway, for reasons they can't quite put into words. That chair by the window hasn't moved, and the table was still set when Deb Akers drove back up there 2 years after Elias passed away, just to see it one last time. She didn't write a single word about that visit in any official report. It was a Saturday, her own time, and she just stood in the doorway for a few minutes before turning around and walking back to her car. Later on, she told a coworker that the cabin didn't feel as empty as she thought it would, saying the air inside had a quality she couldn't name. It wasn't haunted in the way people usually mean, but it felt occupied, as if the space had been molded by one specific life for so long that the shape stayed behind after the man was gone. People in the nearest town, which is a small settlement about 9 miles from the base of that road, stay away from the hollow. It isn't that they're afraid something bad will happen to them if they go up there. It is more that they know enough of the story to feel like the place earned its privacy, and trespassing now feels like the same violation as peeking through the window would have been when Elias was still alive. Some kinds of privacy just seem to outlast the people they belong to. If you go to the county cemetery where Ruth and Thomas were buried, you won't find their names on any public record that's easy to find. Their plot markers are just plain concrete blocks, with no dates and no names, only numbers that match up with a book kept in a back office. That ledger entry simply says, "Unclaimed remains removed pursuant to public health order," which is the only official memory left of 2 people who were someone's entire world for over 60 years. It is just a line of ink and a numbered stone in a row where nobody ever stops to leave flowers. Elias has a marker of his own in a different part of that same cemetery. A small church in Harlan paid for the stone, because those mountain congregations take it to heart that every soul deserves a name on a grave. His marker shows his name and 2 years, the birth and the death, with a short dash in between that is supposed to represent everything he was. That little dash covers the hollow, the cabin, Ruth sitting in her chair, and Thomas at the table. It represents 30 years of morning coffee and evening prayers and the seasonal reports that were never meant for anyone outside those 4 walls to hear. When you get underneath all the ways this story usually gets told, you see what the life of Elias Cutter actually was. It isn't a horror story, even if it looks like one from a distance, and it isn't a story about a man who lost his mind. We know this because the psychiatrist who drove all the way up from Lexington confirmed that Elias was perfectly sane. This is really a story about what happens when you take away every single thing society uses to help a person handle grief, and then you watch what that person builds with whatever scraps the mountains left behind. He wasn't living with ghosts in that cabin. He was the ghost himself. He was the living one, still walking through rooms the rest of the world had forgotten, keeping up a life that looked like a strange habit to outsiders, but was actually a 30-year refusal to let his family vanish without a witness. Every evening around dusk, the mist still rolls down that ridge and settles into the hollow just like it always has. It doesn't care who is watching, or if there's anyone left to see it. The cabin window is dark now, but that chair is still facing out toward the trees. It looks like it's still waiting for something to happen. To be honest, it probably always did. The chair is still there, facing the tree line, where it has sat for decades. It stays pointed at the spot where the mist crawls in,
waiting on a family that isn't ever coming back. You have to wonder if Elias was truly broken, or if he was actually the only honest person in the story. Maybe he was the only one who refused to lie and say that losing the people you love has an expiration date. That is the real question his hollow leaves behind for us to think about. If you have a story about a forgotten place in these mountains, or a person the ridges kept secret, let us know in the comments, because those stories deserve to be told.